Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the next session of Labour Market 2020. Given that this is a conference about employment and skills, you've already heard from the Minister for Skills. It's now my huge pleasure to be able to introduce the Minister for Employment. We've effectively got a full house in a very, very small game of bingo. We have both of them. Arguably, Chris has probably the most important job in government right now. If you look at the opinion polls, the #1 priority of the voters, bar none, is reducing unemployment, increasing employment. And he is the man who is in charge of this important task. I think you now have a little more time than we were worried that you would have. You have to go off and vote, I think, at 22. So without any further ado, it's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome you here today. Chris, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thanks very much, and great to be here. Yeah, sorry, it's not too much for a rush this afternoon, but we've got a vote just after 3:45, so I'm going to rush off then. But great pleasure to be here, to be part of this event. Britain can be a world beater. You don't have to look too far in this country to find examples of brilliant technological breakthroughs, or dynamic entrepreneurship, or finely honed skills. When we want to do so, we can take on the world. And the finest gems are often hidden well away from the public eye. You find them as you go around the country. The small computer games designer that is changing the face of entertainment. The precision engineering firm tucked away on an industrial estate that is a world leader in automotive technology. We can and should be proud of what we do. But if Britain is going to succeed in the future, we can and we must understand the nature of the challenge we face. And we have to respond to it. And I worry that too few people in this country today truly understand the nature of today's world, the opportunities it presents, but also the very real risks to our future. I worry about that particularly as the Employment Minister who month by month sits in the television studios, or indeed today stands in front of a double-decker bus and talks about our unemployment challenge. And happily today, it was one of those months where the figures came down, so it was a more pleasurable experience doing the interview than it has been for a few months. And I think there can be no greater priority for government than to make sure that all of its people have the opportunity to find gainful employment. To create an environment where the labour market is flourishing and where new generations start out in adult life with real-life chances to fulfil their potential. But it's not just going to happen. We live in an extraordinarily competitive world. We already know about the economic challenge that comes from China and India, but actually today the competition comes from unexpected places. Last week the news has all been about Burma and the economic potential there. You've got the potential for Africa to become more of an economic powerhouse. You have some of the amazing statistics around today. Brazil owning 10% of the US national debt. And it hardly seems a moment since Latin America was an economic basket case, facing bankruptcy and depression. The world we live in is changing at an extraordinary rate. So we face unprecedented economic challenges as well as opportunities, and success will not just happen. We have to work for it like never before. That means building an understanding of the world as it is, and not how we would like it to be. And it does often mean a willingness to work your way up from the bottom. And I'm afraid that there are too many people who still just don't get it. Like the Polly Toynbee left, who rail with outrage against the idea of a young unemployed person being offered the chance to do a month's work experience with Airbus, British Telecom, UK Mail or Tesco. Slave labour, they called it. I think that's just insulting to some great companies who are helping young people get a job, not to mention the young people themselves voluntarily and enthusiastically benefiting from placements by picking up the valuable skills and experience they need to get into the world of work. They just don't understand. The people who criticise just don't understand that in today's world, things don't come on a plate. Government can't just create opportunity for all. People do have to go the extra mile if they want to succeed. And nor do the critics understand that you have to create wealth and not borrow it. Then there are the officials in Brussels who sit in meetings about the need to create employment and yet talk about more regulation as the solution. It baffles me that at a time when we face a huge jobs challenge across Europe, that someone in the EU machine thinks it is sensible for it to be spending time legislating the rules in hairdressers rather than concentrating on creating employment in areas of Europe where it is unacceptably high? Don't they understand that more and more red tape drives more jobs to emerging countries and away from Europe? I think creating new jobs should be absolutely at the priority list for the EU, its institutions, and for every government in Europe. And I think any measure that damages employment in Europe should be set to one side. We cannot afford to do otherwise. And then there's the trade union leaders who demand swinging taxes on wealth creators, unrealistic pay rises, and more protection for their members. Do they not realise that in many sectors we are literally only a few business class air tickets away from businesses disappearing from this country to go somewhere else where their wealth creation and enterprise is welcomed and not derided? All these views cannot be allowed to succeed in this country. If they do, we are simply going to be left on the sidelines. We have just got to face up to some simple realities. Britain can only succeed if it fights against these outdated dogmas and faces up to the world as it is. The future is not about more and more regulation to provide more and more comfort and protection for our citizens. If we go down that route, there won't be any jobs to have. There won't be any jobs for them to be protected in. It's not about borrowing more and more money in the hope somehow that the party will never end. It is about sound money, and it is about living within our means. It's not about believing that we'll win come what may. It is about working together to shape up and face competition head on and make sure we do win. As we're starting to do in the contact centre business. Now, I personally think that anybody who offshores their customer service is absolutely mad. We all know, I'm sure you've all experienced, how frustrating it can be to talk to a call centre operator in a far off part of the world who's operating from a script and can't understand the nature of your slightly more complicated problem. So it was a particular pleasure recently to visit the Contact Company in Birkenhead to find a young British entrepreneur turning the tide and bringing customer service back onshore again. Creating jobs in a deprived area that desperately needs them, making our task of tackling unemployment easier, and proving that we can do it in this country. And I think it's on the shoulders of young entrepreneurs like that that the future of employment in this country rests. The days of mass employment in a single company location are largely over. I think one of the most startling statistics I've seen recently was about the success of Nissan in the Northeast. Last year, they built nearly 500,000 cars in the UK. A brilliant commercial success story. But they did it with around 5,000 workers. A generation ago, it would have taken tens of thousands of people to build those cars. So it's just not realistic to believe that we can go back to the world as it was. So we have to unleash more British entrepreneurship and build more international success stories. And I remember Arm Holdings, when it was a tiddly little company in Cambridge that had just designed its first computer chip. Driven by a determined team of entrepreneurs, it would not have shown up on the corporate radar. And yet through determination, hard work, high quality skills, it turned into an international giant, one of our leading technology companies. That has got to be the model for the future. And particularly if, like me, you're so passionate about seeing unemployment come down. But it's not going to happen by chance. It will only happen through determination and hard work, and by government driving out the things that stop our entrepreneurs from building their business. Now, I think the starting point on that front has to be to remove as many barriers to those entrepreneurs as possible. That's why we're working hard to reverse the tide of regulation that has swamped our businesses in recent decades. And also to slay some of the regulatory myths and abuses, because it's not always about the laws themselves. We've made a start, but there is a long way to go, both here and in Brussels. In part, it's about removing regulatory barriers altogether. So, for example, I strongly support the government's plan to extend from 1 year to 2 the threshold before someone can access an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal. Now look, employers don't likely get rid of staff in whom they have invested time and money. But equally, no small firm can afford to carry someone who is not willing to do what is needed to ensure success. In my own area, we're now embarking on a major process of reduction and simplification of health and safety regulations and codes of practice. And we all know good health and safety is extremely important to business. But we've got industries who are dealing with multiple sets of regulations. We've got industries that are dealing with regulations that contradict each other, as well as hundreds of pages of inaccessible guidance. All of that has to change, and it will. Over the next 2 years, we will have rewritten hundreds of health and safety regulations. We'll have cut the number of regulations in half. We'll have simplified, and we will have rewritten all of the approved codes and practice and guidelines to create something that is more streamlined and understandable and approachable for business. And we're also taking steps to exempt 1 million self-employed people from health and safety regulations altogether. But it isn't just about regulation. We also have to make sure that businesses do not do the things that the law doesn't require them to do because of regulatory myths. Now, I went to a small company in my constituency a few weeks ago. I came across a real example about how a small firm can be misled by a consultancy advising what they claim the regulations say, but they don't in reality. I saw their health and safety paperwork on a shelf. It was that thick, 18 inches thick. Absolutely mad for a small business. But before you blame the regulations, I took it off to the HSE and said, how much of this does a small firm like this actually need? And the answer was 10%. So an example of where a firm was being asked to do far more, or encouraged to do far more than the rules actually required. And it brought home to me just how important it is that businesses don't take at face value what they're told, that they are ready to challenge if they think they're being wrongly advised. And we have to make sure the right information is available to them as quickly and easily as possible. So we're setting up through the HSE challenge panels to help businesses get quick and easy advice when they fear they're being misled, so that we can slay some of the myths that hold back our entrepreneurs. Along with all of this, we have to make sure we have a ready, willing and hard-working workforce. We can't afford to go on paying for the cost of a welfare state where millions who can work choose not to do so. Of course, there are many of our fellow citizens who will always need ongoing support, unconditional support for tough health conditions. But no one else should expect to have the ability to simply sit there at someone else's expense. Our welfare state has to be a ladder up which people climb and not a place in which they live. Now, there's a mythology out there that says all benefit claimants are scroungers. That's not right, and it's much too simplistic. My experience is that those who've been on benefits for the long term are more often than not completely lost, lacking in self-confidence, with a firm belief that they cannot get back into work. But of course there are those who don't want to try, and they will get no quarter from this government. But the truth for employers is that most of our unemployed would dearly love to work, though many are ill-equipped to do so. And I've seen many cases where, given a chance, somebody whose life seems to have fallen apart turns things around and turns into a model employee. And even the genuinely feckless can change. A few weeks ago, I met a young man on our mandatory work activity programme. Unlike the voluntary work experience scheme, this is genuinely something we require people to do or they'll lose their benefits. It's designed to refocus people who are perhaps not doing what is needed in their job search. They go off and do a month's work in the community. Not surprisingly, many back off benefits immediately when they're asked to do that. The black market is clearly alive and kicking in many places. But this young man actually was different. He had been totally transformed by the programme. He freely admitted to me he'd been lazy and disinterested, but when he'd actually gone in for his placement, started out in a regular workplace, interacted with other people, he decided it was good, he enjoyed it, he wanted more, he stayed on as an employee, and I think he will be a good employee for the rest of his life. That is how that kind of support can change people's lives as well. It's a big challenge turning around a welfare culture that has lasted half a century. Our reforms will make sure that people will always be better off in work than on benefits. We're reassessing all the people on incapacity benefit. We've set a benefit cap in place, and our work programme is delivering much more personalised back-to-work support than before, alongside a much more flexible way of working in Job Centre Plus. And through measures like the Work Experience Scheme and the Youth Contract, we're doing everything we can to give young unemployed people a first chance in the labour market. It's not just me saying what a good thing work experience is. We've got the evidence to prove it. Yesterday we published figures showing that you are 16% more likely to get a job as a result of going through a work experience scheme than you are if you're simply staying in a conventional job search. And I think it's time for those who've criticised work experience to take a long, hard look at themselves. It's not about exploiting young people. It's about showing them what life is like in the workplace, teaching them skills that are vital to an employer, which they might otherwise be missing, and giving them a chance to shine. And you just have to listen to some of the young people now in a permanent job after doing a work experience placement to understand how important it was to them. I have to say, protesting against the scheme wasn't a fight for the rights of young people. It was an attack on their prospects for the future. It was playing politics with their lives, and we're not going to let people do that. And of course, alongside that, we've increased the number of apprenticeships. We're making big changes to our education system. I think we're putting in place the building blocks for a better future. But we can't do it ourselves. We need a dynamic, vibrant private sector if we're to get those people into jobs. And we need employers who are willing to give people a chance. A few weeks ago, I prompted comment when I said that I hoped every employer would look to give a young, unemployed British person a chance when they recruit. Inevitably, I got the British Jobs for British Workers comments. But that totally misses the point. It's easy to hire someone from Eastern Europe with 5 years' experience, and many employers choose to do so. But those who look close to home find gems too. Turn around the lives of somebody from a difficult background, give them a real opportunity in life, and end up with a model employee as a result. So we should give those young people a chance, help them get into the workplace, and help them turn their lives around. So I stand foursquare behind my view and my hope that British employers will put local recruits first. And of course, that's what the Work Experience Scheme is all about. It's getting young people into the workplace, and it's why the Chief Executive Bernardo said that for many young people from difficult backgrounds, it is a lifeline. And it's also why those people I call the Polly Toynbee left are so misguided. She herself once wrote a book called Hard Work, about the very real challenges and pressures that those on low incomes face. She was right. It is hard work, very hard work, for everyone and for particularly the low paid. Though even those at the other end of the pay scale also often work all the hours that God sends to work and compete and be successful in a difficult international marketplace. There is no other way. But if we're to build a future where our young people have the career opportunities that we all want, where our weak and vulnerable get the support they need, where we can provide the quality of services our citizens expect, then we all have to get stuck in and make sure we succeed. Anyone who pretends otherwise, who believes there is a short way of cutting this reality, is living in dreamland. I want Britain to be at the forefront for enterprise, for technology, for services, for jobs. We can get there, we must get there, but we cannot and we must not believe that somehow it won't be hard work for everyone. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. I mean, there is a lot to think about there, and you've touched on some themes that we're very interested in policy change. I think we now have a little bit of time for some questions and answers. Because we have hundreds of experts in the room, if we can take them together in batches, that might be useful. And if you could just start by saying who you are and where you're from. If we can take the lady in the second row, then the gentleman 2 rows behind you. You might just need a shout, I think. I don't think it's very familiar.
Hello, I'm Linda Syan from Ixton Holdings. Chris, you touched upon the British entrepreneurship and that to be at the forefront. Enterprise is big on the government agenda as much as other things, and business startup helps to generate further jobs. And we talk about shaping policy for a job rich. What future plans or support can the government offer business startups to aid this? And secondly, where we have programs such as the New Enterprise Allowance, which comes to an end in December or 2013, what are the plans beyond
Okay.
That's a great question. Let's take the other one as well with it.
Very simple one. What are you going to do to stimulate employee demand to enable them to take on, to get them to take on new employees?
Well, I think it is about a mix of things. Firstly, it's about reducing the burden of taxation and regulation. I think the cuts in corporation tax that George Osborne announced in the budget will make a difference. I also think the cutting of the top rate of tax will make a difference. You know, it's very easy to think this is all about feathering the nests of wealthy people in this country. Actually, if a South Korean firm is contemplating investing in Europe and is looking at different options, one of the factors that will weigh in the mind of the person taking the decision is coming over to run that operation is, what about me? You know, where am I best off? And if I'm paying 10% more tax in one country than I'm in another, that will weigh on my decision. It may mean we get less investment in the UK. So I think George was right to take that decision. It's about cutting the burden of regulation and red tape. It's also about encouraging entrepreneurship. And in terms of the new enterprise allowance, I mean, so far going well. I cannot conceive that if it is continuing to do well, that we will not want to continue it. I mean, it's begun for an initial two years. But if something works well, you'd want it to survive and continue. And so far, I mean, there are several thousand businesses that have started up as a result. It's not about, there's no one-size solution to this. It's about lots of people in different parts of the public sector and people in the private sector, including the banking world, doing the right thing, pressing the right buttons, removing the barriers that are there, trying to open doors for entrepreneurship. It's about encouraging young technicians at our university to turn their ideas into businesses. Whole range of things we need to do, but it's got to drive right through the culture of this country.
Chris, and then a question from Brad.
Hi, Chris Golden from Joseph Ramsey Foundation. DWP figures show that when someone in a household in persistent poverty gets a new job, 70 to 80% of the time they're not taken out of poverty as a result. And half of men making a new claim for job seekers allowance have made previous claim in the last 6 months. Both those figures indicate there's a problem with job quality as well as job creation. I'm just wondering what your stance is around creating better jobs as well as more jobs.
Good question.
Yep.
And then sort of Matt.
Matt Oakley, Policy Exchange. You, along with a lot of people today, have talked a lot about young people and the problems they're facing in the labour market. And I think the Policy Exchange, we kind of see that being to the detriment of some of the older workers in the labour market. We published stats today showing that they're actually more disadvantaged in terms of getting back to work. And so I just wondered whether there'd be any future kind of focus on older workers and the older unemployed people and the problems they're facing.
Well, I mean, I think for the older workers, self-employment is a very important part, and I've been trying to encourage the Employment Director of the European Commission to make self-employment one of its big themes, because it does seem to me that it is often the case that people are made redundant in their late 40s, early 50s after a long career, but they've got really valuable skills that could be taken into the self-employment field. And so, we will continue. I know Mark Prisk is looking at ways that he can do more to encourage self-employment. The new enterprise allowance, I think in particular, is being picked up and developed by people who are that bit older. And I see that as a key tool for us in Job Centre Plus in helping some of the unemployed older workers get back into the workplace. In terms of the quality of jobs, I agree. I mean, I want more high-quality jobs in this country, more high-tech jobs in this country. I was really delighted this week to see the blast furnace in Redcar reopen, because that's a real opportunity to get some skilled workers back in there. The steel industry is a high-skilled industry. But it's done by small acorns that turn into big trees, and it's done by attracting investment into the UK. And what we want is more technology companies, more new ideas, and whether it's turning that bit of research in a university somewhere in the UK into a thriving business, or whether it's winning a battle to get a major bit of investment in the UK, I completely agree. I want to see more jobs and higher quality jobs.
There are two people right at the back of the room. Take you, sir, and then
Couldn't we use the work programme to actually incentivise quality jobs? Now, obviously, you wouldn't be able to do that with all of the jobs, but you could create some incentives via the work programme to do that.
Well, if you look at, two aspects of that. First of all, on the work programme itself, the way it's structured, the fact that the providers are not paid in full until somebody's been in work for at least 18 months, means that they cannot simply plan their strategy around getting somebody into a whole series of short-term placements. That doesn't really get them to where they need to be. The cost of doing that, the payment structure means it's just not cost-effective for them. So what you do, and I always describe the work program as a giant employment dating service, and the ones who succeed in the work program will be those that know the employers, understand their needs, deliver the right people for the organisation, and that is much more likely to create sustained employment. And what we have done in recognition of the challenges at the youth unemployment end of the market by introducing the wage subsidies in the youth contract, we're providing a financial incentive to an employer who takes on a young person, but by channeling those subsidies through the work program, that same principle of providers are all finding the placements, not getting paid in full for 18 months, means I hope the focus will not be on just finding a short-term placement, but actually getting young people into an environment where they're starting a proper career.
James Kelly from Aegis. Had some really interesting discussions here today about integrating skills and back to work support. We know at Aegis we've got lots of clients who really lack basic skills. They can't read and write, they don't know how to use the internet. We are desperately trying to kind of tap into the SFA budget to be able to kind of bring what should be really basic skills into work program clients. I think structurally things can be made easier if governments will work a little bit closer on it. I'm just looking for your support really.
Okay. Well, there's no question that that support is there, and I mean, John Hayes and I, perhaps unlike our predecessors, talk to each other regularly and closely. But I guess I'll throw a challenge back at you. I won't name names, but I went recently to the office of one of your competitors and found an SFA-funded provider doing SFA-funded training work with some of the work program participants. So it can definitely be done, but we'll certainly do everything we can to try and remove barriers.
We absolutely are using
Yeah.
SFA-funded money
Yeah.
where possible. We actually think, to be honest, that we can do better than some of the existing SFA providers.
Yeah.
But they operate in a closed market in many
Right.
respects.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, we'll talk offline about this, and I know our team works together. It's clearly in our interest that we maximise that opportunity.
Very quickly, one answer to that question from the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, Array over a Prospect Services. It's quite interesting because after several decades of government, in a sense, standing back and saying, we're not going to differentiate between service sector and manufacturing or whatever, with the coalition government, there does seem for the first time in a number of years to be a greater interest in having some balance and government taking a view on that. Is that something that is really a theme, or have I...
I think we believe him. If you look at the last 15 years, the economic activity that took place before the recession was driven very substantially by financial services, house building, and public spending. None of those are clearly sustainable on that scale in the long term, and therefore we need a rebalanced economy in order to make sure that we're not just dependent on a small number of areas. And so, whilst we're not into picking winners and saying, well, that firm versus that firm, we do want to see a broader mix of technology and manufacturing and to become a much more dynamic entrepreneurial centre.
Chris, I'm afraid we are completely out of time. You were about to be helicoptered away back to
Indeed.
Parliament. But thank you so much
That's
for
all
making
right.
your time to us today. Extremely interesting speech. Good answers to all the questions. Thank you so much
That's
for
all
coming.
right. See you soon.